Power rarely appears fragile while it is losing flexibility. Most systems look stable right up until the moment their response time begins to slow, until decisions that once took days begin taking weeks, and weeks begin taking months no one can account for. This is a story about that slowing, not about the fall of a government, but about the long interval in which a government kept functioning while its capacity to act kept narrowing. In France, between the late 1880s and the eve of the First World War, the Third Republic governed a nation that still obeyed, still voted, still assembled its ministries, and still, underneath all of it, was losing its ability to trust its own reflection. This was not a republic in ruins. It was a republic that had begun, quietly, to doubt whether its institutions still described the country they governed. The Third Republic was born in defeat, proclaimed in 1870 after the collapse of the Second Empire, and built by men who did not fully trust the system they were assembling. Its constitution was a patchwork of provisional laws, passed in 1875 by a single vote, designed less to inspire loyalty than to prevent any faction from seizing permanent control. Power was distributed across a president with little authority, a chamber of deputies prone to fracture, and a Senate meant to slow everything down. Ministries fell with startling regularity. More than 50 different governments rotated through office between 1871 and 1914. Yet the state beneath them persisted, staffed by a permanent bureaucracy that outlasted every cabinet reshuffle. Administrators in the provinces learned to expect instability at the top and continuity underneath. Authority still functioned, but it functioned by design around its own weakness, not through confidence in its strength. By the 1890s, pressure had begun to accumulate in places the Constitution had never anticipated. The Panama Canal scandal exposed bribery reaching directly into the Chamber of Deputies, implicating ministers and financiers alike, and for the first time, large numbers of citizens openly questioned whether their representatives served the Republic or merely extracted from it. Investigating magistrates moved cautiously, aware that too aggressive an inquiry could destabilize the government itself. Newspapers filled the silence with accusation, and the accusation outran the evidence. Regional prefects, watching from a distance, delayed enforcement of unrelated administrative rulings simply because no one could say with confidence which ministers would remain in place long enough to answer for them. Authority had not lost control. It had lost the ability to move quickly without fracturing something else. Then came the Dreyfus Affair, and with it, a deeper, more structural strain. When Captain Alfred Dreyfus was convicted of treason in 1894 on falsified evidence, the case became less about one officer than about whether French institutions, the army, the judiciary, the press, could be trusted to correct their own errors. For years, the military command resisted revisiting the verdict, not out of certainty in Dreyfus's guilt, but because reopening the case threatened to unravel the presumed infallibility the army depended on to function. Meanwhile, government after government tried to avoid confronting the question directly, calculating that any position risked alienating half the electorate. Junior officers received instructions to say nothing publicly, unsure whether obedience or silence carried the greater risk to their careers. The Republic did not collapse under this pressure. It absorbed it, slowly, unevenly, while legitimacy narrowed year by year into something more defended than believed. The pattern repeated in different forms. When the government moved to separate church and state in 1905, ending a century-old concordat, it did so only after years of hesitation, aware that any resolution would alienate a significant portion of a still devout population. Local priests in rural parishes waited months for clarification on how church property would be handled, adjusting their sermons to uncertainty rather than settled law. The Republic pressed forward with reform, but each reform arrived later than the pressure that produced it, and each solution generated a new constituency of resentment that the next government would have to manage rather than resolve. Institutional rigidity did not appear as refusal. It appeared as timing, as decisions correct in substance but consistently late in arrival. Labor unrest added another layer to the same strain. Strikes among railway workers and miners in the years after 1906 forced ministries into a posture they had not chosen and did not fully control, alternating between concession and repression, depending on which seemed less likely to trigger a parliamentary crisis that week. Prefects in industrial departments received contradictory telegrams within days of one another, first urging restraint, then urging firmness, and factory foremen adjusted shift schedules without knowing whether the standing order would still apply by the following morning. None of this broke the state's authority over labor, but it revealed, with increasing clarity, that policy was no longer being set so much as improvised against whatever pressure had most recently proven loudest. By the years just before 1914, the strain had become structural rather than episodic. Cabinet instability meant that long-term policy, military preparedness, industrial coordination, foreign alliance commitments increasingly passed not through elected ministries, but through permanent officials in the foreign ministry and general staff, men who remained in place while governments dissolved around them. This preserved continuity, but it also meant that the visible face of French authority, the elected government, held less and less command over decisions that would determine the nation's fate. Provincial administrators, accustomed to shifting instructions from Paris, began treating certain directives as provisional until reconfirmed by whichever ministry happened to survive the season. Authority had not been transferred. It had simply migrated toward whoever could remain standing long enough to exercise it. By 1914, the Third Republic stood at a limit it had been approaching for 2 decades. It could still govern. It could still mobilize an army, pass a budget, hold an election. But its capacity to respond to a genuine emergency now depended on structures that had grown around its own fragility rather than despite it. A permanent bureaucracy compensating for ministerial turnover, a public accustomed to scandal outpacing resolution, a legitimacy sustained less by trust than by the absence of an alternative anyone wanted. The Republic still believed recovery from any single crisis remained possible because it had recovered from so many before. That belief was not yet wrong, but the room in which it could keep proving itself right was narrower than it had ever been. History rarely announces the moment authority stops describing the country it governs. It simply keeps functioning, a little slower each time, until the gap between decision and consequence becomes the only stable thing left. The Third Republic did not fall in these years. It endured, and it would go on enduring, through a war few of its ministries had fully prepared for, and decades beyond. But endurance and confidence are not the same condition, and by 1914, only one of them was still fully intact. Authority often appears strongest just before its choices begin to narrow. If this exploration stayed with you, you'll find more on timeless questions.